Hey guys, welcome back to Learn Python the Hard Way. In this exercise we are going to continue building our web application using Flask, but we build on top of what we learned in the previous exercise and will learn how to handle input from a browser using forms. Before we get started with the forms, let's take a very quick look at how the web actually works. So the way it works is shown here. When we type a URL into our browser, then basically we are sending a request to our computer's network interface, and from there the request goes over the internet to our server. So on the server here we would then trigger the index.get handler here to get our requested file back, so the index file by default, which is returned to the server and then back over the internet to our network interface, where the response is returned to our browser. And this is how we can then see the response actually in our browser. And so there are a number of different terms we need to be familiar with. The browser is of course the software we're using to access the internet. We have the address, the URL, Uniform Resource Locator, that we're using to indicate where the browser should go. And that's of course not the only protocol that can be used, which is HTTP, but there are other protocols, for example, to transfer files, file transfer protocol FTP, which is an alternative to HTTP. Then we also need to create a connection, and that means we are going to open a port on our computer. So in production applications, that's usually port 80 that we're using, but it could be on different ports as well. And then we have the requests that we are sending over there, for example, here to our browser. So for example, if we are requesting, let's say /book at the end of the URL, then we want to have the file, the resource at book returned, and most servers will actually use the real file, which would be book/index.html, but basically they pretend it doesn't exist, so basically we can just request book at the end of our URL. And of course we have a server which is used to host our application and handles the request we are sending and responds back with the appropriate response. And our response is then returned back from the server back to our browser, is rendered and displayed to us. So that's a very quick overview how the web actually works. And now let's switch over to how forms work and how we can use them in Flask. And the best way to see that is actually to get started with a Flask application here. So we can modify the same file that we used in the previous exercise to work with Flask and to actually use forms. We need to import Flask, of course. We need to import render template from Flask and also request. And then we are having a route called /hello with the index method here. But this time actually we are storing a request, get request here, with the parameters name and nobody in name. And if name is provided, then we're going to return a greeting where we pass in the name. Otherwise, if name is empty, we're just going to return the greeting hello world. And that greeting here will then be returned as part of our render template method here. So we are calling render template with index.html, which is our HTML file that we created before. And then we pass a greeting to it as a variable. So if we do that, let's just hop over to our terminal here, and we are just going to build on top of the code that we worked on in the previous exercise. So let's actually open up app.py, which is our Flask file here in our code editor, and then we need to make those changes to our existing application. I already updated it here, so all we need to do now is to actually run our server here. So I'm going to type in Python app.py, and that's going to start our Flask application. And that's going to be here on port 5000, which is the development port that we're using when developing this application. And of course, if we think back, we are actually using the route /hello. That means on the root route here, we're actually not going to get any response back. So instead we need to go to /hello. And now we get back, I just wanted to say hello nobody, which is using the index HTML file that we created last time with a styling here. and we have the variable greeting in here, which we render. And of course we get back nobody, because that's what we pass in here as an argument to name. So now we can actually start creating our own HTML forms to accept user input and to pass that to our browser. So just one addition before we do that, we actually can directly pass some values to our server here just using the URL. So here, instead of, as we have it right here, having hello, we can go ahead and pass in some arguments. So for example, name Bob, for example, we can press enter, and then Bob will be rendered here. So we are using the URL here to pass in another argument, and that will be passed in here as a variable and can then be used in our script. So that's how we could make changes to it, make an update to it. And it's also possible that we pass in more than one argument. So we could go ahead and, for example, change or add a second argument, for example, greeting in here. So we are always using those key value pairs. We can go ahead and, for example, pass in name Frank and greet Ola. So let's do that. And we can just connect those by typing in an @. And of course, that's not going to change anything apart from the name, because we still need to update our app.py file to actually render out greet that we updated here. So to do that, we can just make a minor change. If we take a look at app.py again, we can just go ahead and add a second line here after getting name. We can do the same for greet. And here we want to get greet, and we pass in the default value hello. And now we can go ahead and say greeting. We're going to update that to, instead of hard coding hello in here, we can put in greet like this. And then of course, if we don't provide a parameter in our URL, it's just going to use the default hello. But if we pass in a different value, for example, Ola, then that should actually be updated here. So it may just take a second, and then we see whatever we pass in here will be displayed. And of course, if we go ahead and we remove greet, we will switch back to the default hello value here. So that's one way of how we can update that directly from our browser using a GET request. But of course, that can be a bit bothersome to do that, especially for our users. So a better way to pass in values is actually to use HTML forms. And to do that, we can create a new HTML file called hello_form.html, and here we can use a form. So if we take a look at that, we have just a general HTML page that we construct. What's new is this part here. So we add the form tag in here. We add the action, which is, or the /hello, the resource we're going to, and we add the method. So we are going to use the post method instead of the get method. And here we are going to use an input field of type text, and very importantly, we are going to add a name to it and set that to greet, and a second input field for the name, and here we pass, or we set name to name, and we have a submit button. And then we also need to make some changes to our app.py file. So here we need to update the route and add those two methods. So now, since we have the post request, we are going to use that, the post request, and also the get request. And now we also need to say that we need to differentiate if we get a post request or else a get request, and based on that we can make some changes here. So let's switch over to our file. And if we take a look at this, this is our hello_form HTML file with our form in here. And then we also need to update our app.py file. So here we're going to change our route, and we will add those two method arguments, so post and get. We're going to set the greeting to hello world. And we're going to differentiate if the request method is post, which basically means we are going to send our form. Then we're going to set the variable for name to whatever request.form for the name value here returns, which is of course what we enter into the name field. And we are going to do the same with greet. And in order to identify what we actually want to store in here, when you see form brackets name or brackets greet, we take another look at our form over here. Those are basically the names of the input fields. So here we have name and name greet. And this identifies the different input we provide. And when we enter the input in here, that will be stored back in either name or greet. And then of course we can say greeting should be greet, name. And then of course we need to return that. We're going to render a template. And we will pass in index.html and set greeting to greeting. So this part hasn't changed, but of course how we get the values is quite different. And if instead we are not using a post request but a get request, then we're just directly going to say we're going to render the template hello_form.html. So this is our updated app.py file. Let's now reload the page here. We can head over to hello. And now we can see this form here is displayed. And actually, let me just remove very briefly one line that we don't need yet. So here we have our form. It says a greeting and your name, and we can pass in a value. So for example, hello Bob. Click on submit, and now it returns the hello Bob and renders that template. So the form is not very pretty if we take a look at that, but it's functional. And the way it works again is we pass values into our input fields here, and since we connected or we assigned the name to it, that is then stored and passed over to our app.py file and is used in there. And here in our if statement, taking a look at app.py, we again differentiate if we actually go to that page with a post request, which means we are actually sending our form, or if we're using the get request, which would just render the empty form, and we can provide those values. So we are using the same route here, /hello, to do both the get and the post request, depending on whether we send off the form or we are just requesting that page to display the empty form. Now, as an exercise, we can actually add a link back to /hello on our index.html page. So if we filled out the form, we can very easily access it in the future. And to do that, if we just take a look at our index.html file, what we can do is we can just add a link by using the a tag with an href, and then we could either just write in / and then the page we want to go to, so hello form, or we can use this snippet here, which is a method that Flask provides. So here we can use URL for and then pass in index and of course the text of our link, so back to form. And the way it works is URL4 uses whatever URL is assigned to the index method. And if you take a look at app.py, you can see we defined index in here. And so therefore this is going to take the route hello here and goes back to that. So if we switch over to our form and we fill out those values here and send that off, we can say we have now this link back to form, and by clicking that we head back to our form, so we can very easily fill it out again with those values. So it's just a very small exercise and we can very easily update that in here. Now we created two separate HTML files which have basically a very similar structure, and to have basically a common layout and to avoid code duplications in our different HTML files, we can use a layout template. That basically means we have a structure that we use over and over again, and we can use the Jinja 2 formatting styling language here to basically insert that. So to do that, we can create or update our HTML files within our templates folder and basically add extends layout.html and then add block content and end block at the end. So we basically removed the beginning parts with the HTML and the head and body tag, and instead we just added here the if greeting to end if in here. So basically the specific part for our index.html page. And we can do something very similar to hello_form.html. So here we also say extends layout.html, and below that we add our block with the content. And what we're doing here, we are stripping out the boilerplate at the top and the bottom and only basically add whatever is changing inside of block content and end block. But of course we still need some place where we actually have that boilerplate in there. We store that in layout.html, which is a file that we can create also inside of templates/layout. And here we basically include that boilerplate part. So here inside of layout.html, we add HTML, basically the entire rest of the boilerplate part of the HTML page. So HTML, the head tag, the body tag, and then inside of that we have this block section here, block content and end block. And this is basically the part that will always be replaced in those different pages whenever we basically write here block content and block. That will be inserted here in the layout section, or vice versa. When we say extends layout.html, we basically include that structure in there, and so we don't have to write it over and over again. So that's a very handy way to avoid repeating ourselves here and to keep our boilerplate code separate from our actual HTML pages that we are changing and editing. So if we take a look at that, we have our index.html page here with extends layout.html, block content and end block. And of course we have our layout.html where we include our basic structure, and we need to make sure that we include block content and end block. Now, since we're working with our new web application using forms, we should also make sure that we can test that properly using automated tests. And of course we're going to use nose test as we did in the previous exercises. So we learned that in exercise 47, and now we are just going to build on top of that. Of course, in terms of the structure, we are going to include that in tests, in a tests directory under the name app_tests.py. And here we can import nose. And then one step that's quite handy, we can say from app import app. So if you think back, we have our application name called app.py, which is the first app. And inside of that, if we take another look, we actually set up app to be assigned to the Flask application. So by writing from app import app, we basically are importing our Flask application and can use that inside of our test file. So that's very handy to use. We're doing some configuration here at the beginning, and then we create a test case called test index. And here at the beginning, we are using our application that we imported and call test client on that and assign that to web. And now we can use the web variable here and call a get request on it. For example, if we get slash, which of course, if we think back, it's just here our root page, we get back a 404 because that's actually a route that's not defined. So in our test, we actually say web get root page slash, so we want to follow the redirect, and then we assert equal that what we get back here, when we call get on this, the status code of that is actually equal to 404, which we saw here. And we can basically do the same using the hello page. In this case, of course, we would get back a page. So our form that we have been using. And so the status code for that would be 200. So that's what we expect to get back. And then we can also check for the actual content we get back. To do that, we can use assert in, which we haven't used before yet. And we are basically checking if the text fill out this form, which is the heading here, is actually inside of our file. And instead of using F as we did before, we are using B, which is basically the bytecode we are getting back, and we're comparing that to our web page, to the actual data in there. And we can not only check our get call, but also the post call here. So we just can create some data dictionary with the name and our greet variable. And then we can start a post request to hello. And here we pass in data, which is our dictionary here. And then we can assert that the name Z here in this case that we pass in is actually inside of that data, and also that Ola is on the page. So that's a way how we can test our web application. And so if we set that up, we can of course open this. So here we have app_tests.py, which is a file that we can open, and then of course we can simply call nose tests to actually run our test setup and test our web application this way. So heading back, we of course have to make sure that we are not inside of the tests folder, but actually in the root directory. And now we can call nose tests on that, which runs our tests and should actually show us that we don't have any errors in our code, so that we properly tested everything. And if you get an error here, you may have to make sure that you actually install nose tests inside of the virtual environment, and then that should work properly. You may have to deactivate the virtual environment and then activate it again. And if you run nose tests, then it should work properly. So that's how we can basically test our web application and make sure that while we're writing out our production code, we actually can test it as well and make sure that it works properly. So let's take a look at some of the study drill sections here. We should read more about HTML and then basically give our form a better layout. We can draw that on paper if you want and make it look a little bit better. Because if you take a look at this, our form is pretty ugly at the moment. And of course we can style that a bit better. We could also make some additions to the form here itself and add maybe additional input fields. But if you want to improve the style, we will of course use some CSS for that. And to do that, we can just hop over to our file. And what we want to update is actually our hello form.html. this overview page here. And to update that, since we basically factored out the layout.html, we can head over to layout.html, and here we can link a style sheet. So as an example, here we have a styles folder, which if we take a look in our application, we have styles here as a folder, and that's a typical place where we would add our styles in there. So here we have a CSS file called styles.css, and we are linking to that using the link tag. We are associating a style sheet here, and then we are linking using, again, the Flask syntax here, URL4. We're taking a look at the static file, and the file name should be style/styles.css. So this way we can insert our CSS file, and if we then take a look at our CSS file, which is over here, we basically style our input text. We also assign it a background color, and we make some adjustments here. So for example, to the padding, to the margins, the box sizing. And now once we reload the page, it should actually look at least a bit nicer. I may have to restart the application because I terminated it before. So let's restart that. And of course, we always have to make sure to be inside of our root folder, otherwise that won't work. All right, so we are restarting that. We can navigate to our hello page. And now we can see our form looks at least a little bit nicer. So we can, it still works, just the styling has been adjusted. So now we can add the greeting here. And the name, we can click on submit. It still works. Now you can see the background is also changed on this page here because we of course used we included the CSS file on our application.html file, and so the styling we applied will be used on every single HTML file that we are working with. If we don't want that, then of course we could simply import that on the individual pages outside of application.html, but it helps to keep the styling consistent across multiple pages. So that's how we can adjust our forms and make them look a little bit nicer. Now, the second exercise here is to figure out how we can do a file upload so that we can upload an image and save it to our server. So to do that, we can first of all quit our server here. And for that, actually, I created a separate folder. Or excuse me, not a separate folder, but a separate application called app_file upload. And then there's another associated file. So this here just imports, again, Flask from Flask. We have an upload folder that we define. Typically in Flask, we would store our files inside of the static folder, inside of uploads, which is a separate directory that we can create. So if we take a look at that, we have our static folder here. So if we look inside of that, we can see we have not only the styles folder, but also the uploads folder, which we can of course create by typing make directory. And then inside of the static folder, we can create the uploads folder. And then we basically instantiate our Flask application, a new Flask application. And here we are configuring our upload folder to be equal to what we defined up here. And we can also set a maximum content length, so to make sure that our files that we are uploading, our images, are not too large, for instance. Now the actual code is inside of this main.py file. So if we take a look at that, we are importing a bunch of files here. What's important is that we are using a Werkzeug here, and we are importing secure file name, as well as, of course, Flask, Flash application to display some messages, request, redirect, URL4, and render template, which we used before. And we can then also restrict which kind of extensions we would like to support. So here, for example, different image types, PNG, JPEG, and GIF files. And then we define our route here, the root route, to be the upload form, where we render our upload.html template, a separate file that we are using. And then we can use the route file here with the post method to actually upload our image. And we are checking if the file name does not exist, then we can say there's no image selected for uploading. If the file actually exists and it's part of the allowed files here, then we set the file name equal to the file name here using secure file name, and then we save it here importantly in the upload folder that we define, so inside of the static/uploads directory. And we display a message using the flash message that we imported up here, that the image was successfully uploaded and displayed on the page. And then we are rendering the upload HTML template, so let's take a quick look at that. Which is inside of the templates folder, of course. So here we are including our form to upload our file. Important, we set the enc type here to be multipart form data, which is required for the file upload. We then use an input field to upload a file of, so to use the input with type file. And we also set this to required in this case, so that we can't send off the form without selecting a file. And then we have a submit button here to basically confirm this. And the upper part is here just to display messages if we successfully uploaded the file, and then to display a flash message once we have done that. And then if we try to upload a file that's not allowed, we of course should get an error message for that, and then redirect to the page where we can upload the file. So this is an application. I will also link a separate resource to that, which actually described how to properly set that up, and where there's also some example code referenced. But now if we go ahead and we actually run our application, we can do that by typing in python main.py. We can see an example of how we can actually upload a file. So let's switch over to our application, and now we see we can select a file to upload it. We can choose our file that we want to select. And here I'm just going to select a simple file, a PNG file in this case, and I can click on submit. That is now going to upload the file, and the file is being rendered here on the overview page. So that's basically how we can import, or we can actually include a file import, and how we can instantly display images, for instance, that we upload here. Now the next one is a little tedious. We should go to the HTTP reference, which describes in detail how HTTP works, and read as much of it as we can, which can be handy every once in a while. And I will link to that document in the description below. But as you can see, this is a documentation here which is quite extensive. It's over 100 pages. This is a PDF document. There's also an HTML version. But if you just take a quick look at the table of contents, we can see there's of course an introduction with the purpose, the requirements, etc. But quite importantly, we also see, if we go down here, information about the messages, the message types, headers, body, the requests, the connections, the methods we can use, and then very importantly the status codes and what they actually mean. So whenever you see the status code 1 followed by several digits. That's informational, successful, as we saw before, status code 200. All of those start with a 2. And if we have a status code that starts with a 3, that's a redirect from a separate page to another one. If we have an error, a client error, that's starting with a 4, so for example 404, file not found, which is quite common. And then if instead we have a server error, that would start with the number 5. So most commonly, of course, we have error 500, internal server error. That is most frequently used. So I'll link that below, and that describes in detail the different HTTP methods and in general the documentation about HTTP. So if we want to, we can also actually deploy our application using a web server like Apache, Nginx, or some other solutions. I'm actually not going to do that now, but I'll link in the description below some instructions on how to do that. So if you're interested in doing that and to actually deploying your application on the web, that can be some helpful resource. And then finally, we should just take a break and try to create as many different web applications as possible, just to get very familiar with working with Flask, on how to test our web applications, and to get familiar with, for example, working with forms. And then, of course, there are different ways to break our applications, and especially if we decide to actually deploy our application using a web server, we should, of course, be very certain that there's no sensitive information that can be accessed by a hacker. So there are 3 different exercises here. How much damage can we do with the Flask debug setting on? And we should be quite careful so that we don't wipe ourselves out doing that. Just as a reminder, that was described in the previous exercise, but if you go ahead here, we can actually say export debug 1, and then we can restart our application. And then the debug mode here is activated, and we get some additional information doing that. And that, of course, can be tricky, because we may display more information than we want to if we work with it. So we should be quite careful about that. So the next one is if we don't use any default parameters for the forms, what could go wrong? So if we take a look at our code again, let's just switch over to app.py. We are using here the request form for the name and the greet variable, which we inserted inside of our hello form.html, these ones here. So if we didn't use that, then in theory someone else could pass some values to our server and basically damage our application this way. So you may want to be careful that nobody else can actually pass some information to it and update some information. It's especially critical if you're using a GET request methods instead of the POST request, because then using the arguments, that's actually visible what's displayed there, and some changes could be made there. And finally, in our code, we are checking for the POST request and then anything else. So looking at that again, here in app.py, we are checking if the request method is of type POST, or else if it's some other method, then we return the render template. And we can use the curl command line tool to generate different requests and see basically what happens. So if we go back to our terminal, we could, for example, use curl here. So if we go ahead now, we have our server started and we type in curl with the URL here. We can see by default we have a GET request, so we basically get back the HTML of that page that is being rendered out, which is returned here. That would of course be part of the else branch here. Now, if you perform a different HTTP method, for example, if we say we want to perform a delete request here, so in this case here the method is not allowed. That's what we get back, and that's of course because if we take a look at our code again, we only allow the methods post and get, so thereby we basically ensure that no other HTTP method is supported here. So in this case here we are trying to actually delete the page, and here we get back 4 or 5 method not allowed. The method is not allowed for the requested URL. So by inserting that first line here, we basically ensure that the else branch here would only have a GET request and no other HTTP method. So that's it for this exercise, and in the next and final exercise we are going to actually build our web application and then publish it on the web, building on top of the game that we built previously. So see you guys in the next video.